Tonight's story is The Shadow, written by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a tale not meant to comfort, but to awaken a quiet unease. It is a story about the self, about the lies we tell the world, and the darker truth that follows silently behind us. Please listen, and do not turn away from your own shadow. Chapter 1. The Learned Man in the Southern Land. In the cold countries of the north, where the earth sleeps beneath snow for long months, and human voices grow quiet with the season, there lived a learned man. He was not wealthy, nor was he powerful, but he possessed something he believed far greater than either, a deep trust in reason. From an early age, he had devoted his life to thought. He studied language, philosophy, and morality. He believed that the world, though often cruel and confusing, could be understood if one observed it patiently and spoke honestly. To him, truth was not merely an idea, it was a responsibility. He believed that once truth was discovered, it must be spoken, and once spoken, it would naturally be recognized. This belief shaped his entire existence. When the learned man traveled south, he believed the journey would change only the climate around him, not the convictions within him. But the southern land greeted him with a light, unlike anything he had known. The sun did not simply illuminate objects, it exposed them. Walls shone white, streets burned gold, even shadows appeared sharper, darker, as though they had been drawn deliberately upon the ground. The learned man felt unsettled, though he could not explain why. He told himself that this discomfort was merely physical, the heat, the brightness, the unfamiliar customs, yet something within him felt examined. At first, he welcomed the warmth. In the north, cold had encouraged reflection. Here, warmth encouraged motion. People lingered outdoors late into the night. Laughter drifted freely through open windows. Voices rose and fell without restraint. The learned man observed them carefully. They spoke with confidence, yet often without precision. They believed strongly, yet rarely explained why. He noticed that arguments here were not won by logic, but by certainty. Whoever spoke with the greatest assurance was believed to be right. This troubled him. Surely, he thought, clarity must matter more than confidence. Truth must matter more than comfort. And yet, as days passed, he noticed how easily people turned away from difficult truths. They preferred pleasing illusions, gentle words, and agreeable appearances. The learned man did not judge them, at least, not consciously. He told himself that every land had its habits, every culture its own way of seeing. Still, a quiet doubt began to take root.
At night, alone in his rented room, he reflected on his observations. The room was simple, with white walls and tall windows that allowed moonlight to spill freely inside. When he lit his lamp, his shadow appeared on the wall behind him. Here, in this land of strong light, his shadow was no longer faint or modest.
It was large, dark, distinct. It moved with a sharpness that unsettled him. He watched it closely. It is nothing, he told himself, a trick of light, an effect of the southern sun. And yet, as he sat reading and writing late into the night, he could not shake the feeling that something unseen had grown nearer. The learned man did not know it then, but this was the beginning, not of a journey outward, but inward. Not toward knowledge, but toward division. For in that land of brilliance, where everything seemed visible, something had begun to separate itself from him, silently, patiently. Chapter 2. The Mysterious House Across the Street. Directly across the narrow street from the learned man's lodging stood a house unlike any other. It was not taller, nor more ornate, nor more brightly painted, and yet it seemed to possess a presence. During the day, it appeared quiet, almost withdrawn, its windows half closed, its walls pale beneath the sun. But when evening came, the house awakened. As dusk softened the sharp edges of the city, light began to glow behind its windows. Not harsh light, not the blazing brightness of the southern sun. This was a gentler illumination, warm, inviting, alive. Soon after, sounds followed. Soft music drifted into the street, sometimes laughter. Sometimes voices speaking too quietly to be understood. The sounds were never loud, never demanding. They simply existed, as though confident they would be heard. The learned man found himself listening, at first without intention, later with growing attention. He told himself that his interest was purely academic. This house, he reasoned, represents something cultural, a gathering place of art, perhaps a salon, a home of poets. Yes, poets. That thought pleased him. He had written extensively about beauty, about art, about the elevated power of imagination, and yet he had always observed these things from a careful distance. Night after night, he sat by his window and looked across the street. He never saw the inhabitants clearly. Sometimes a silhouette passed behind the curtains. Sometimes a shadow lingered near the window, but faces remained hidden. This absence of detail made the house more compelling. Perhaps, he thought, true beauty should not be examined too closely. Still, discomfort accompanied his fascination. The house represented something he had avoided. Emotion without explanation, expression without justification, pleasure without moral defense. These things unsettled him, and yet they drew him in. I study such things, he reminded himself. I analyze them so that others may understand. But another thought followed, quieter, less welcome. Have I ever truly lived them? Each evening, as the learned man watched, his shadow lengthened behind him in the southern light. Shadows did not behave modestly. They stretched boldly, clinging to walls, sliding across the floor. The learned man noticed this only gradually. Each evening, as the learned man watched, his shadow lengthened behind him in the southern light. Shadows did not behave modestly. They stretched boldly, clinging to walls, sliding across the floor. The learned man noticed this only gradually. At first, he paid little attention. Then, one evening, he realized that his shadow did not merely follow him, it leaned. The shadow angled itself toward the house across the street. Its outline grew distorted, elongated, as though straining to reach something beyond the window. The learned man shifted in his chair. The shadow shifted too, but not quite as expected. It lagged, it resisted, then it followed. Strange, he thought. He stood, walked across the room, and stopped. The shadow obeyed, but reluctantly. It stretched farther than necessary, its edges darkening. The learned man felt a faint unease, the kind that arises when something familiar behaves unexpectedly. It is nothing, he told himself, a simple effect of light. Still, he returned to the window. The house across the street glowed softly now, music flowing more freely. Laughter, not careless laughter, but knowing laughter, the kind shared between those who understand something together. The learned man felt suddenly outside, not excluded, but separate. He was a witness, not a participant, and for the first time in many years, that realization troubled him. He imagined stepping into that house, not as a scholar, not as an observer, but simply as a man. The thought made his chest tighten. What would I find there? He wondered. Beauty, perhaps, or chaos, or truths that could not be arranged into clean arguments. Behind him, his shadow deepened. It pressed itself more firmly against the wall. It no longer seemed content to remain flat and silent. The learned man turned away from the window. He sat at his desk and attempted to read. The words blurred. His thoughts returned again and again to the house across the street, to the voices, to the light, to the possibility that something essential lay there, something he had never allowed himself to touch. I am a man of reason, he reminded himself. Curiosity must be disciplined. Yet even as he thought this, his shadow leaned once more toward the window, as though listening, as though remembering, as though waiting for permission. Chapter 3. Life Without Shadows. As the days passed, the learned man became aware of a subtle change within himself. It was not a sudden realization, nor a dramatic disturbance. Rather, it was a quiet erosion. His thoughts returned more often to the house across the street than to the books upon his desk. Words that once held clarity now felt distant. arguments he had mastered, seemed oddly insufficient. He was not distracted by ignorance, but by something far more unsettling: possibility. At night, he found himself lingering longer by the window, not every evening, not deliberately. And yet, his body seemed to remember the way, even when his mind protested. He told himself that observation was harmless. To observe is not to participate. He reasoned. Distance preserves judgment. Still, he listened. The house across the street continued its quiet ritual. Music rose and faded. Laughter appeared, then dissolved. Voices spoke, not to persuade, not to argue, but simply to exist together. This unsettled the learned man more than open disorder would have. There was no thesis to refute, no claim to dismantle, only life, unconcerned with explanation. What are they doing in there? He wondered, not out of suspicion, but out of a curiosity. He no longer entirely trusted. He imagined conversations without structure, feelings without hierarchy, moments that did not require justification. Such things had always existed, of course, but they had existed outside him. Now they pressed against the edges of his thought. Behind him, his shadow grew restless. This restlessness did not announce itself with motion at first. It revealed itself in tension. The shadow clung more tightly to the wall. Its edges appeared sharper, as though resisting dissolution. When the learned man shifted his weight, the shadow lagged, only for a heartbeat, but long enough to be noticed. He turned suddenly. The shadow snapped back into place, perfectly obedient, perfectly silent. The learned man felt a faint embarrassment. "I am imagining things," he told himself. He returned to his chair. Yet the sensation did not leave him. The room felt crowded, though nothing had entered. The air felt thick, though the window stood open, and beneath it all, a strange awareness stirred, as though he were no longer entirely alone with himself. One evening, as the city outside settled into its nightly murmur, the learned man spoke aloud. Not loudly, not with intention. The words escaped him, as naturally as breath. "Go and see," he said. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadow remained where it was, pressed against the wall. The learned man almost smiled at himself. Of course, he thought, a foolish impulse. Then the shadow moved, not suddenly, not dramatically. It stretched, slowly, deliberately, its outline thinning as it lengthened across the floor. The learned man froze. He watched, unable to decide whether to speak again or to remain silent. The shadow reached the edge of the room, then the door, then the threshold. The learned man did not follow. He told himself, there was no need. It is only light, he thought, only reflection. Yet his heart beat faster than the thought warranted. Outside, the sounds from the house across the street seemed momentarily louder, the music clearer, the laughter nearer, as though something unseen had crossed into a space where it belonged. Minutes passed. The learned man waited. He did not know what he expected. A return, a sign, a sensation. Nothing came. The shadow did not reappear. At first, the learned man felt amusement, an odd fancy. He told himself nothing more. He returned to his desk. He read. He wrote. He tried to resume the rhythm that had always sustained him. But the room felt different, lighter, and yet less complete. He rose and stood beneath the lamp. There was no shadow behind him. The learned man stared at the wall, longer than was reasonable. It will return, he thought. Shadows always do. But a quiet unease settled into his chest, not fear, not yet. Something colder, something like the recognition that a boundary had been crossed, without ceremony, without permission. He went to the window. The house across the street glowed softly, unchanged. Life continued there, as it always had. Music. Voices. Light. Nothing acknowledged the loss that had just occurred. The learned man realized, with a clarity that startled him, that he had not commanded his shadow. He had released it. And for the first time, he wondered whether some parts of the self, once sent away, could ever truly be reclaimed. Chapter 4. The shadow return. The morning light entered the learned man's room gently, as it always had. Nothing in the city suggested that anything unusual had occurred during the night. Carts moved through the streets. Vendors called out their wares. The southern sun rose, confident and brilliant. Only the learned man noticed what was missing. He stood by the window. As the light fell across his body, there was no shadow at his feet. At first, his mind rejected the sight. He shifted his position, stepped closer to the wall, raised his arm. Still nothing. The wall remained bare. A strange calm settled over him. Not relief, not panic. Denial. This is temporary, he told himself. An effect of the angle of the light. It will return. Shadows always did. He dressed carefully and left the room. As he walked through the streets, he felt lighter than before, not physically, but inwardly, as though a pressure he had long carried had been quietly removed. The sensation disturbed him. Loss should hurt, yet this loss felt empty. At first, no one said anything. People passed him as usual. Some nodded. Some did not. The learned man almost convinced himself that nothing had changed. Then he noticed the glances, not direct stares, but quick looks that lingered too long. Eyes dropped away when he turned toward them. Conversations paused as he passed. Something unspoken had entered the space between him and others. At a market stall, the merchant hesitated before taking his coin. At a cafe, a chair was subtly shifted away. The learned man felt the distance grow. Without a single word being spoken, he returned home unsettled. He stood again beneath the lamp. Once more, there was no shadow. This time, unease reached deeper. A man without a shadow was not merely unusual, he was unnatural. The learned man began to understand what his absence signified. A shadow was proof of presence, proof of belonging, proof that one occupied space, as others did. Without it, he appeared incomplete, unreal. I am still here, he thought. I speak, I think, I reason, yet reason offered no comfort. Human society did not rely on reason alone. It relied on signs, and the learned man had lost one that required no explanation. Days passed, the distance grew. People avoided prolonged conversation with him. Some smiled politely, but their eyes held uncertainty. Others looked at him with open suspicion. A few with something close to fear. The learned man felt himself shrinking. Not in stature, but in presence. He spoke less. When he did speak, his words seemed to float, without weight, as though they belonged to no one. At night, alone in his room, he searched the walls for something that was no longer there. The lamplight flickered. The walls remained empty. He began to feel exposed, as though something that once protected him had been stripped away. The shadow had hidden imperfections, softened outlines. Now there was nowhere to retreat. Perhaps this is punishment, he thought, for curiosity, but the thought felt insufficient. Punishment implied intention. This felt more like consequence. Gradually, the learned man's certainty eroded. Truth still mattered to him, but truth without recognition felt fragile. What good was truth, if no one accepted the one who spoke it? One evening, as he sat in his room, a realization settled heavily upon him. He could not remain in this land. Here, difference was tolerated only when it entertained. Here, being unseen was safer than being strange. The learned man made his decision quietly. He would return north, to the land of softer light, of longer shadows, of silence. Perhaps there his shadow would return. Perhaps there he would once again appear whole. He packed his belongings, books first, then papers, then the small personal objects that reminded him of who he had been. As he closed his case, he paused. For the first time, a doubt crossed his mind. If my shadow does return, he wondered, will it still be mine? He extinguished the lamp. The room fell into darkness, and for the first time, the learned man felt what it meant to be entirely alone with himself. Years passed. the learned man returned to the northern lands, to the softer light and the longer evenings. Yet the shadow did not return. Seasons changed. Winters came and went. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. Still, no shadow followed him. And slowly, painfully, the learned man adjusted to life as an incomplete being. He learned to walk carefully, to stand where the light was weakest, to avoid moments when his absence would be most apparent. He learned silence, not the peaceful silence of reflection, but the cautious silence of concealment. He became smaller in the eyes of others and eventually in his own. At times he wondered whether the shadow had ever truly been his. Perhaps, he thought, it was always something separate, something waiting for the chance to leave. This thought frightened him more than the loss itself. One evening, long after he had abandoned hope, there came a knock at his door. Not loud, not urgent, firm. The learned man froze. Visitors were rare now. He rose slowly and crossed the room. When he opened the door, a man stood before him. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the visitor. He was well dressed, confident in posture, and carried himself with ease. Yet something about him felt familiar. The learned man felt an instinctive unease, not fear, recognition. "You do not know me," the visitor said calmly, "but I know you very well." His voice was smooth, measured, untroubled by doubt. The learned man searched his face. Every feature seemed clear, well-defined. To clear. "Who are you?" the learned man asked. The visitor smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, precisely. "I am your shadow," he said. For a long moment, the learned man could not speak. The words made no sense. Shadows did not stand upright. They did not knock. They did not speak. And yet, something deep within him knew. "You left me," the shadow continued, "but you did not destroy me. I learned. I observed. I became complete." The learned man felt a strange reversal within himself. This being before him spoke with certainty. He himself felt only confusion. "You have changed," the learned man said at last. "Yes," the shadow replied, "and you have not." They sat together. The shadow spoke freely. He spoke of the southern land, of the house across the street, of what he had seen there, not poetry, as the learned man had imagined, but people. They spoke of what they desired, the shadow said, not of what they should desire. They acted without asking permission from ideals. They were admired, not for truth, but for confidence. The learned man listened. Unease grew within him. The shadow spoke of things the learned man had always known in theory, yet avoided in practice. "You studied humanity," the shadow said. "From the outside, I lived it." There was no accusation in his voice, only fact. The learned man felt something tighten in his chest, not jealousy, not anger, inferiority. The shadow leaned forward slightly. "I can help you," he said. "I know how the world listens. You still speak truth, but truth alone is no longer enough." For the first time in many years, the learned man felt the temptation to be understood again. "But you are my shadow," he said weakly. The shadow smiled. "Am I?" he replied. "Or are you now mine?" The learned man did not answer, because somewhere within him, he feared the answer. Chapter 5. The Master and the Shadow Reversed. At first, nothing appeared to change. The learned man and the shadow spoke as equals, or so the learned man believed. They sat together in the evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes in long conversation. The shadow never raised his voice. He never commanded. He merely suggested. "You might phrase it this way," the shadow would say. "People respond better if you begin with certainty, or leave that part unsaid. Truth is stronger when it feels discovered." Each remark sounded harmless, helpful, practical. The learned man listened. He told himself that advice did not diminish authority. To accept guidance was not to surrender judgment, and yet he began to notice that his own words no longer came first. Before speaking, he now paused, not to reflect, but to recall what the shadow might recommend. His thoughts bent slightly, almost imperceptibly, around another presence. When he spoke publicly, people listened more attentively than before, not because his ideas were new, but because they were framed differently. Certainty now preceded explanation. Confidence softened doubt. The learned man felt relief, and with that relief, a subtle dependency formed. The shadow watched quietly. He never interrupted success. He praised without enthusiasm, criticized without cruelty. See, he would say, it is not what you say. It is how the world hears it. The learned man began to doubt his former methods. Had I been naive? He wondered. Had I trusted truth too much to defend itself? The questions unsettled him, but the results comforted him. Gradually, the shadow assumed small freedoms. He answered questions. When the learned man hesitated, he clarified points. Before confusion could arise, people began to address the shadow directly, at first accidentally, then naturally. The learned man noticed, but did not object. He told himself that partnership required flexibility, that effectiveness mattered more than ownership, yet something in him recoiled. Each time his voice went unheard. At night, alone in his room, the learned man reflected. He still saw his shadow now, but it no longer mirrored him perfectly. Sometimes it moved first, sometimes it stood where he had not yet stepped. This is only fatigue, he told himself. Change always feels strange, but a deeper thought pressed forward. What if this is not change, but replacement? The shadow sensed his hesitation. He spoke gently. You are tired, he said. Let me handle the unnecessary parts. Rest is not weakness. The learned man wanted to believe this. He wanted to rest. He wanted the burden of explanation to lift from his shoulders, so he allowed it. Without ceremony, roles shifted. The shadow spoke more. The learned man listened more. No declaration marked the moment. No conflict announced it. The reversal occurred, as such things often do, quietly and too late to resist. Chapter 6. The shadow gains power and success. The transformation did not occur overnight. There was no single moment when the shadow suddenly stood above the learned man. Instead, recognition arrived in fragments. A nod here, a pause there, a question directed to the shadow instead of to the man who once had been its source. At gatherings, people now waited for the shadow to speak first. When he did, the room leaned toward him. Subtly, almost unconsciously, the learned man noticed this. With a tightening in his chest, not anger, not resentment, a quieter emotion, irrelevance. The shadow moved with ease among others. He laughed at the right moments. He listened without appearing burdened. He spoke with clarity, but never with doubt. His words were simple. That was their strength. The learned man stood nearby, often just a step behind. When he spoke, people nodded politely. When the shadow spoke, they agreed. It is only style, the learned man told himself, not substance, but substance without attention. Had begun to feel hollow. The shadow's reputation grew. He was described as decisive, insightful, reliable. People said he understood how things truly worked. The learned man had spent a lifetime seeking that understanding, yet now it was the shadow who was credited with it. The learned man began to withdraw, not because he was dismissed, but because he anticipated dismissal. Silence felt safer than correction, observation safer than participation. The shadow did not discourage this. He never said, "Step aside." He simply stepped forward. When the space appeared, and space always appeared. Soon, the shadow was invited where the learned man was not. Private discussions, important dinners, rooms where decisions were shaped. The learned man learned of these gatherings only afterward. At first, he asked questions. Later, he stopped. The answers unsettled him. The shadow explained everything calmly. It is practical, he said. They need certainty, not complexity. Your thoughts are deep, he added gently, but depth frightens people. The learned man felt shame, not because the words were cruel, but because they were accurate. The shadow began to accumulate influence. His presence smoothed conflict. His assurances ended debate. People trusted him, not because he was right, but because he never appeared unsure. The learned man watched. As his former ideals were reshaped, truth was shortened, nuance trimmed away, complexity replaced with conviction. Each change was small, each seemed harmless. Together, they altered everything. One evening, the learned man confronted the shadow. "Is this truly success?" he asked quietly. The shadow regarded him with something like patience. "Success," he replied, "is being believed." The learned man felt something collapse within him. All his life, he had believed success meant understanding. He had been wrong. The shadow's rise continued. He acquired wealth, connections, titles. Doors opened before him, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented: certainty. The learned man accompanied him often. He stood at the edges of rooms, watching conversations unfold that he no longer shaped. Sometimes he was introduced. "This is my associate," the shadow would say. The word stung. Associate, not origin, not equal. At night, the learned man stared at the wall. The shadow there no longer mirrored him. It stood tall, even when he sat. It gestured, even when he remained still. How did this happen? He wondered, but the question arrived too late. The shadow now spoke on his behalf. He answered questions before the learned man had time to think. When corrected, the shadow smiled. "Details," he would say, "unnecessary ones." The learned man felt himself fading, not physically, socially. Conceptually, he was present, yet unaccounted for. The shadow began to dress more richly. He carried himself with authority. Strangers addressed him with respect, some even with deference. The learned man noticed how easily respect followed power, not wisdom, not virtue, but visible control. One afternoon, as they walked together, the learned man stopped. "I am becoming invisible," he said. The shadow did not deny it. "You are becoming free," the shadow replied. "You no longer need to explain yourself." The learned man did not answer. Freedom had never felt so close to erasure. The shadow smiled, not unkindly, not triumphantly, inevitably. Chapter 7. The Fate of One Who Speaks the Truth. For a long time, the learned man said nothing. He watched. He listened. He endured. Silence, he told himself, was not surrender. It was patience. Yet patience, when prolonged too long, begins to resemble fear. At gatherings, he noticed how his presence was no longer required. No one asked for his opinion. No one awaited his clarification. When he did speak, his words floated briefly in the air. Before settling nowhere, they were not challenged, they were ignored. The learned man felt an unfamiliar sensation, not disagreement, erasure. This cannot be right. He thought, truth does not vanish simply because it is inconvenient, and yet, he had begun to witness precisely that. The shadow now spoke as authority. When questions arose, all eyes turned to him. When doubt appeared, he dissolved it with confidence. No one asked how he knew. Knowing was assumed. The learned man began to feel that truth itself had changed. It was no longer something discovered. It was something declared. At first, he attempted gentle correction. A word added here, a nuance restored there, each time. The shadow smiled. "Of course," he would say, and then continue as before. The learned man realized that correction required recognition. Without recognition, truth had no anchor. One evening, as they walked home together, the learned man stopped. "I must speak," he said quietly. The shadow turned to him. "About what?" he asked. "About myself," the learned man replied, "and about you." The shadow regarded him carefully, not with anger, with assessment. "You may speak," the shadow said, "but consider carefully what it is you wish to achieve." The learned man took that night to reflect. He sat alone in his room, beneath the lamplight. His shadow on the wall stood taller than he did. If I remain silent, he thought, I will disappear. If I speak, I may be destroyed. He realized then that truth does not protect those who carry it. It exposes them. The next day, at a gathering filled with important faces, the learned man stood and spoke. His voice was steady, not loud, clear. I must correct a misunderstanding, he said. A murmur passed through the room. The shadow did not interrupt. He merely watched. I am not the associate, the learned man continued. I am the original. The man you now follow was once my shadow. The room fell silent, not in contemplation, in discomfort. Someone laughed softly. Another shifted in his seat. Eyes avoided the learned man's gaze. The shadow sighed gently, a metaphor. He said smoothly, our friend enjoys philosophical imagery. Laughter followed, relief. The learned man felt heat rise to his face. No, he said, I speak literally. I am the man. He is my shadow. This time, the laughter was louder, not cruel, dismissive. The learned man looked around. Faces that once greeted him with respect now regarded him with caution, some with pity, others with suspicion. You see, the shadow said softly, this is why I cautioned you. Truth, when it unsettles too much, becomes dangerous. The learned man felt a final clarity. He was not being debated. He was being managed. Soon after, arrangements were made, discreetly, efficiently, for the learned man's well-being. He was escorted from places where he once belonged. Doors closed gently, but firmly. The learned man protested, not loudly, not wildly, reasonably. That was what frightened them most. You are tired, they told him. You have worked too long. Rest will help. He was confined, not in chains, but in care. The learned man understood the irony. Truth had been reclassified as illness, in solitude. He reflected one last time. I believed truth would be enough, he thought. I believed reason would protect me. The shadow visited him once. He stood calmly, hands folded. I am sorry, the shadow said. And for the first time, he sounded sincere. You do not have to do this, the learned man replied. The shadow shook his head. I do, he said, for order, for peace. The learned man closed his eyes. He finally understood. The shadow did not hate truth. It simply had no use for it. After that day, the learned man was no longer spoken of, not openly, not directly. His name ceased to appear in conversation, in writing, in memory. It was not forbidden. It was simply unnecessary. People said he was resting, that he had been overworked, that his mind required peace. These explanations satisfied everyone. No further questions were asked. The shadow, meanwhile, continued. His presence became constant, expected. Where once he had been introduced, now he was awaited. Where once he had explained, now he declared. And the world accepted this, as though it had always been so. The shadow married well. The ceremony was elegant, tasteful, and perfectly arranged. Guests spoke of harmony, of balance, of a promising future. No one mentioned the learned man. The shadow's authority expanded quietly. He advised leaders, resolved disputes, spoke on matters of culture and morality. His words were quoted, his judgments repeated. Each repetition stripped them of origin. They became simply what was known. At times when he stood beneath strong light, the shadow noticed something unusual. There was no shadow at his feet. For a brief moment, unease stirred. Then it passed. I am complete, he told himself, and the world agreed. As for the learned man, his days narrowed. Rooms became smaller, voices fewer, time stretched, unmarked by recognition. He was treated kindly. That was the most painful part. No cruelty, no hatred. Only care. Care that did not listen. He spoke less and less, not because he had nothing to say, but because words, when unheard, begin to dissolve. Sometimes he wondered whether he still existed. If existence required witness, what was he now? One evening, As twilight fell softly through the window, the learned man looked at the wall. There was no shadow. There had not been one for a very long time. He felt no anger, no despair, only clarity. I was wrong, he thought. Truth does not rule the world. It only reveals it. The learned man closed his eyes, and in doing so, he disappeared, not with noise, not with resistance, but with the quiet completeness of something that is no longer required. Outside, life continued. Children played, merchants argued, music drifted through open windows. The world did not notice that anything had ended. The shadow lived on. He prospered. He was admired. He was remembered. And no one questioned why his success cast no shadow. Everyone has a shadow, but if that shadow became wiser than you, stronger than you, and more loved by society than you, would you still be able to remain yourself? Thank you very much for watching.